Hi guys, this is Alex with Milk Crate Garage, and today we're going to go over how to set the ignition timing on a Tecumseh HS40. We're going to start by pulling the shroud off, then we're going to gap the points, set the timing, and we're going to set the position of the piston with a dial indicator, but not the Tecumseh one because most people don't have one. We're going to use a dial indicator from Harbor Freight or what have you, which is easily bought and easily found. So let's get into it. So the tools you're going to need for this job are as follows. You're going to need a dial indicator, which is the tool on the left. You're going to need a couple of screwdrivers, both slotted, a pair of pliers, 7/16 and 1/2 inch wrench, or if all you have is a 11mm and a 13mm, those will work. They're not ideal, but they'll work. You'll also need a 13mm socket to pull the cylinder head, along with a ratchet, and a 17mm socket, or whatever the standard equivalent is, to pull the nut that goes on the flywheel. You'll also need a multimeter to gauge when the point's open, and I'll add other tools to this list as we go on. We're going to start by pulling the 3 head bolts that hold the shroud on. So this motor is from a 1970 Rupp Roadster and is a Tecumseh HS40. It's specific to the Rupp because it has a lighting coil, which powers the lights, a lighting flywheel, which has extra magnets to power the coils. It has an exhaust stub for the Rupp exhaust, and it has a 3-inch ball bearing supported crankshaft for the Rupp torque converter. So it's kind of a special motor. I actually bought this motor from a friend of mine who bought it on eBay. We got it running together, and I'm just showing for the purposes of the video how to take it apart. It is missing the diaphragm carburetor that came on 1970 Rupps. I have it somewhere. I have to dig it out and put it back on. So there's a total of 5 bolts that hold the shroud onto the motor. There are 3 in the cylinder head area, and 1 on the right side and 1 on the left side at the bottom. Once those are out, the shroud should slide right off. Once the last bolt on the left side is removed, the shroud is going to slide right off and expose the flywheel. Once we remove the shroud, you'll see what that looks like. So there's the flywheel. Underneath the flywheel is the magneto, which is what we're going to change the position of to set the timing. The next step is going to be to remove that flywheel nut, which we're going to use a 17mm socket for, or whatever the equivalent is in standard, I don't recall. So we're going to break it loose. Now, if it's really tight, you might need a Tecumseh flywheel holder tool, which I have. If not, you're going to have to use an impact gun and just lightly impact it off, and that should be enough to remove it without damaging anything. Make sure it's on loosen, not tighten, obviously. You don't want to over tighten the nut and break the end of the crankshaft off. That has happened to some people, so be aware of that. So we got it broken loose, and now it's time to remove the flywheel nut. Once you remove the flywheel nut, there's going to be the starter cup and the starter screen. Those will just slide right off. There's also a conical washer. Don't lose that. I lost mine during the shooting of this video, and I had to find a replacement, and that took a week. So don't lose yours. Now you can see the lighting flywheel. This flywheel has extra magnets around it just to power the coils that power the lights. Someone also drilled a couple of holes in it. I'm not sure why, but there's one there and one there. The next step is going to be to pull the flywheel off. To do that, we're going to use a 2-jaw puller. You could use a Tecumseh flywheel knocker, which is a threaded piece of steel that threads partially onto the crank. Then you put tension on the back of the flywheel and smack the flywheel knocker and it pops the flywheel off. Unfortunately, I don't have one, so I'm going to use the puller instead. So we have the flywheel puller positioned. Next step is going to be to tighten down the shaft that pulls the flywheel off, and it's going to put some tension on it, and if it's not enough, we might lightly tap the end of the shaft with a hammer, but fortunately it was enough just to tighten it. Now we're going to remove the flywheel, see the magnets, and that is going to be your magneto. That's what we changed the position of to set the timing. Now we're going to pull the cylinder head off. That is held on with 8 13mm or 1/2 inch bolts. Usually when you remove a cylinder head, you start with the outside bolts first, then you work your way to the inside bolts. So you start with the bolts at the edge first, then you work your way to the middle bolts, basically. So the reason we're removing the cylinder head is because we are not going to be using the Tecumseh dial indicator tool for this video. Most people don't have one. It's very handy. It fits down the spark plug hole, but since most people don't have one, I'm going to show you how to do the more difficult way with the more basic tool, which is going to be a Harbor Freight dial indicator with a magnetic base. Once we remove the last cylinder head bolt, the cylinder head should come right off, and we actually set the timing according to the position of the piston in the cylinder in thousandths of an inch before top dead center, which is the uppermost travel of the piston. Next, we're going to remove the points cover by removing the small metal clip. We're also going to remove all the wires from the point stud, as if you don't have those removed, they can give a false reading on the multimeter. To remove the points cover, you got to stick a screwdriver underneath the clip and it'll pop right off. Once the clip is off, we will remove the points cover and that'll expose the points. Now we can see the points. The points are the set of electrical contacts that fire the coil. You can see them there. Basically, when the points are closed, the magnets that pass by the coil energize the coil. When the points open, that magnetic field collapses inside the coil and the spark fires. That's what we are setting when we're setting the timing, is the opening of the points. Now your contact points are set with a 20 thousandths of an inch gap. To do that, you first have to set the points cam to its highest point, which it is, and then you put a feeler gauge in between the contacts, right there. Once you actually put the feeler gauge in there, you can tell that the gap is too small in this case because there's a gap at the upper part of the points where they contact the lobe. See, if there's a gap up there, that means the gap over here is too tight, and the points gap needs to be widened a bit. To widen the points gap, you simply unscrew the slotted screw right there, and that'll give you enough adjustment to move the points to where they need to be. Now what I like to do is, well, I like to push on this side and then make sure that the feeler gauge is in there nice and tight. See, there's a gap there. We have to close that up, and then that should be pretty close. Let's tighten up the screw and check. So right on the money. You see that this doesn't move when we stick the feeler gauge in, but it does drag a little bit, which is good. And then, yeah, the points are set at 20 thousandths. Next step is going to be we're going to hook up a multimeter. One end is going to be ground. I usually put the ground in between the aluminum and the felt wiper. It holds it nice and well. And then I put the other end right here under the nut. Oh, I forgot to disconnect this wire. Let's do that right now. That's out of the way. We're going to put the nut on there and tighten it down to make sure that the multimeter stays on there. Now when you're using your multimeter, make sure it's set to ohms. I usually go around 2000, that's a good range. Let's put the ground in here. There we go. And we're going to put the positive lead of the multimeter between the nut and the plastic piece on the point stud, like so. At this point, the points are open. You can tell by the reading on the multimeter. We're going to crank the motor over until the points close, and I'll show you what that looks like as well. So right now the points are open. That's an open reading on the multimeter. And then when you move the crankshaft, they will close and the meter will read like so. So we're going to set the position of the piston relative to top dead center. The measurement that it's supposed to be is 35 thousandths before top dead center. If you run a higher octane fuel, you can run up to 65 thousandths before top dead center, but I generally don't recommend that. Now we have the dial indicator set up on top of the piston, and it's at top dead center. We're just going to double check to make sure it is. Wiggle the crank around a little bit. Yep, it's at top dead center. And now we have to rotate the motor counterclockwise until the reading is 35 thousandths before top dead center. So you got to rotate the motor backwards so that it's before top dead center. If you rotate it the other way, it'll be after top dead center, and you'll never be able to set the magneto to the correct position. So at this point, we have to make sure that the points open at exactly 35 thousandths before top dead center, no sooner, no later. We do that by loosening up the two bolts that hold the magneto and rotating it until we just barely get the points to open at exactly 35 thousandths. Sweep the magneto back and forth. Okay, so the points are closed now. Okay. That seems to be the point at which they open. So let's double check. Rotate the motor counterclockwise. Points are closed. We'll see exactly when the points open. Right there. That's 40 thousandths. So what we're going to need to do is to make the timing less advanced. To do that, we have to move the magneto in that direction. Let's see what that does. Counterclockwise, points are closed. Points are open at 30 thousandths or 31 thousandths. That's not advanced enough, so let's move it back a hair. See what that does. Counterclockwise, move it clockwise. Right there. That is, let's see, 37 thousandths. So let's tighten down the two bolts. And we'll double check to make sure that everything is more or less where it should be. Now that the bolts are tightened, turn the motor counterclockwise till the points close. We'll see when they open. Right there, that's 35 thousandths right there. And then double check to make sure that the motor's still top dead center. Yes it is. So now the points are set. The ignition timing is set correctly. These bolts are tight. Now it's time for reassembly. We'll start by pulling off the dial indicator. And I'm going to switch to landscape mode. So next is the points gasket and points cover, or whatever this gasket is called. Slip these wires through here. Oh, forgot to pull the nut off. Now I would advise people to use a wrench for this nut. I don't have the correct size wrench. Per pliers works fine, but over time you can kind of mess up the nut. nice and tight. All the wires are there. Nothing's touching the ground. Time to put on the flywheel. Make sure the flywheel key's obviously in position. And time to put on the flywheel. Starter cup is next. This you rotate it a little bit until these 3 tabs line up with the 3 divots in the starter cup. So just put it on, rotate it a little bit, it'll pop into place. The next step is to install the conical washer onto the shaft. I lost mine and had to find a new one, so this clip is actually a week or so later than when I first started filming. Fun fact. Anyway, washer's on, you gotta thread the nut on and then torque down the flywheel nut. Once the flywheel nut is torqued down, you can begin to install the shroud. Simply slide the shroud on, making sure nothing is catching on the edges. And it should just slide right on. Then insert the head bolts. The middle one has a shorting clip that shuts off the engine when it touches the spark plug, so be sure to install that one in the middle. And another bolt on the outside. It's all back together. Now we're going to put gas in it, see if it'll fire up. To be continued in part 2.